Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Between the Freight Lines, a podcast hosted here at Rogers & Brown. My name's Berkeley Brown. Today, I'm joined by Gabe McGann, who's going to go through some different talking points with you today. Those being the CAPE refund processing and how that's continuing to expand, the appeals court temporarily pausing the CIT ruling on Section 122 tariffs, some continuing Section 301 investigations, and also how importers are continuing to face uncertainty and compliance pressure. Gabe, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Berkeley. Just starting with the talking points you just mentioned, we'll begin with the biggest topic in the market right now, which is the CAPE system. The big news is refunds were going out this week. So actual money is in the bank accounts of importers. Some thought that that might not ever happen, but it has, and I'm very glad to see it, I'm sure. It's still in phase one of processing, and we've helped several clients ourselves file their CAPE refunds, and the process has been fairly simple with some minor bumps in the road. There continues to be errors, which the majority of them actually, from what we have seen, tend to be on customs end, to where they have certain time frames where I don't believe the system was expecting IEEPA tariffs. Their IEEPA tariffs needed to be applied. It's when Section 122 was coming in and the executive orders were being issued. So they're working to figure that out and will be resolved, I'm sure, in later phases. The unfortunate part is we haven't gotten much of an update on later phases. I was hoping that yesterday's update to the CIT was going to contain, at least some kind of guideline on where they are with these additional entries that are not eligible to be filed in CAPE, but nothing really came of that. Yesterday's update, just to bounce right into that, was that 15.1 million entries have passed the CAPE validations, 8.3 million entries already liquidated or reliquidated, and estimated refunds and interest total $35.46 billion, which is a very big number that the Treasury is dealing with right now. But from what we've seen is there are kind of reports available in ACE for importers to track their refund statuses. We have been getting a couple questions on that, so I thought I would actually mention that. Customs sent out an email dated May 4th, reminding importers of several reports that have been issued into the ACE portals. Most notably the ES022, which is a CAPE entry summary report. Then the Revenue 603 trade refund report would probably be the most impactful, and that's going to show the importers, once these have liquidated, what status they're in and when the refunds were sent to Treasury. And they are titled with CAPE, so you can see the difference between maybe a drawback refund, a PSC or protest refund, or a CAPE refund. They are identified very nicely. And we ourselves saw many importers that we work with who have actually filed their own declarations, and some that we filed ourselves were already getting refunds. So very exciting to see. There are quite a few delayed because the importers, against everybody's advice, ours included, have not set up their ACH refund account. And I do understand that there are some odd little issues when you're a foreign importer and don't have access to a U.S. bank. I think most of these are simply importers in the United States that failed to set the ACH refund up. One of the guidelines that we are taking before we file for a client who, a lot of clients are filing for themselves, which they found to be quite easy, and others have entrusted us, which we're happy to help with, and we understand the trepidation perhaps in doing so. But one of the check marks for us is that they have the ACH refund set up before we act, just so these don't get added to a queue that grows and grows and grows. The importers, of course, will always have the opportunity to get the refund. They're just going to sit in limbo until the ACH refund is set up in their ACE portal. So anybody that's listening that might be in that situation, just get on your ACE portal, pop in your routing and account numbers, and your refunds should start flowing your way. I guess it'll be really interesting. I mean, this is not unlike your tax refunds on a year-to-year basis. But it's a lot of money coming out of the Treasury, so I'm sure they have a lot of pressure on them right now, and I don't know if there'll be a trickle-down effect to other sectors, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a gap once the liquidation occurs and then, being sent to Treasury. It definitely seems like there's a couple week kind of time period there. So anybody that sees a liquidation on their reports, don't be afraid if you haven't seen your refund yet. It should be coming, but there is a bit of a delay between the systems, which is probably expected being such a new process.
And something I also wanted to point out with this $35 billion, an interesting point are these interest rates that people are getting back. Do you have any points that you would like to make about that?
Well, good news for the importer. They're getting more money than they paid. So, I mean, I guess they were out the money for, whatever, maybe a year, not so much a year in some cases, but they're definitely getting paid interest. I don't have the exact figures on the amount of interest that was going out, but it tends to be pretty significant when you get those big numbers. So,
So if you need another incentive to get that ACH information in, that's definitely one of them. Moving on to the Section 122 appeals, do you want to talk a little bit about what the CIT came back with?
yeah, so I don't believe we actually covered the original case in the first place. So I just to note, here we are, Twilight Zone, all back to last summer, but the 122 tariffs have been somewhat deemed not necessarily illegal, but were struck down in the Court of International Trade. And then quickly, the government, as expected, appealed that. So there was a stay, and in this case, there were, I believe, two importer or groups that were involved in this lawsuit. And the interesting part of this ruling from the CIT, which was by no means unanimous, it was a pretty close ruling, was that they only granted the reprieve from the 122 to the particular people filing suit. Now, that's not for people listening to worry about right now, because it was always expected that the appeals would happen just as it did with the IEEPA tariffs. And we were just talking, and I believe the original court case was decided for IEEPA tariffs in July, around July of last year. So it took 7 months for resolution in that. It's going to take some time here, maybe not quite that long. Will it go to the Supreme Court? I'm not sure, but at the end of the day, it is being appealed. There's nothing for importers to do right now. Everybody's still paying 122 tariffs that go through, I believe, July 24th is when those expire. It's just something to keep in mind, and we will continue to update our clients and our listeners on this, because at some point they may need to join these cases on the back end, which is something that was happening with the IEEPA cases as well. When people weren't sure if that was going to be necessary or not, it ended up not being necessary, but not to just assume that won't be the case here, or that will be the case. It very much might mean that each importer has to join the lawsuit to get the same benefits that those did. But right now it's like we're back in square one, and could we see another Cape situation for 122s? Quite possibly.
So best practices right now for businesses are just to stay informed and go from there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nothing to do right now. Your brokers, like ourselves, will be continuing to process your entries with the tariffs that are applicable, which currently are Section 122, unless you're paying, the 232s. That's just good business to stay informed, follow the news, but these court cases will take some time.
And then just continuing on our tariff topic today, I just wanted to touch on the 301 investigations that are currently going on.
Yeah, so the 301 investigations tend to be country specific. So I have seen, and probably most people have seen in the news, that several countries are being investigated for different reasons. And in fact, there's actually an additional 301 investigation on China, where there already is a 301 tariff in place that's been in place since the first Trump administration. Vietnam is another one of the countries that we should be closely watching. A lot of the places that, some of the trade shifted when people were diversifying from China are the first countries that are going to get these types of investigations. On top of that, there's also going to be more 232 investigations, which again are product specific. So, any products that the government sees as an issue, as they did with steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, Those are ones to kind of keep an eye on. There is no real news to report in those areas. Perhaps those start taking the place of where the country-specific negotiations left off with IEPA, and get back to similar numbers down the road. We don't know. But what we do know, and at least what we understand, is that the Section 122 does expire and cannot be extended. So that will end on July 24th of this year.
Do you think that we could see more tariff actions during this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're going to do everything possible to get these back to the level they were before the Supreme Court struck down IEPA tariffs. I think in a lot of cases, I think the countries they were negotiating with were on board, and it wasn't necessarily a disagreement of the disparity, the trade disparity. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much more to come. We don't know. They're obviously throwing the kitchen sink at it. Some sticking and some has not, and it's obviously causing a lot of work on the back end and a lot of money to change hands in different directions. But they're not going to give up without a fight. That's for sure.
Yesterday, I was talking to Beth, our VP of Customs Compliance, and she actually mentioned that with these Section 301s, that around 60 countries are being investigated. So it will be interesting to see what comes from that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that just paints the picture of where all those agreements lied, and they're going to try to, this might be the best path to get back to where they were.
Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today? Some things that our importers should be looking for in this upcoming year?
Yeah, there are a couple things. The first is, we've talked to several clients, and it's going to be very interesting what people do with the IEPA refunds. In some cases, I think that's going to be passed down to their customers, and perhaps there was some type of an agreement in their purchase order or not, and they just want to remain friendly with the people who are purchasing from them. Others we've talked to are going to put it right back into inventory. So I think that kind of leads a little bit into the possibility of what happens this summer. Typically, starting June, July is a peak season. People gearing up for the holiday seasons. It's one of those things that's almost been a yearly occurrence. However, probably the last few years since COVID, a bit different than it always once was. But I'm wondering personally, this is me kind of just spitballing here, is that will we see a bit of a peak season? People are going to be flush with some cash in some cases. If they do dump that into inventory, are they going to target importing at the end of July, early August, in hopes that perhaps there's a bit of a pause in some of these tariffs, or they don't have enough time to get a 301 or a 232 in place? Will this give a little bit of a window to importers? We don't really know, but we do know is that the market is up right now in the freight world. Some of that is manufactured by the carriers. There have definitely been plenty of blank sailings happening in the market. That is not uncommon. When you're talking about MBOCC contract season and BCO contracts starting May 1st they're valid May 1st through April 30th in a lot of cases. So they're always trying to start those contracts up on a higher level, especially, and get the spot market on a higher level. They've done so. The rates have increased gradually since really the end of March. And we've seen another increase coming into the market this month. The rates are definitely much higher than they have been for, at least a year now. So the carriers are in a good position. There's quite a bit of backlog, specifically in the Asian markets, a lot of rollover. So I think you're starting to see the beginning of what could be a bit of a space crunch peak period where rates are going to be higher. Fuel costs are obviously higher due to the situation in the Middle East. That has not stopped. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the carriers are really yet to even implement some of the larger bunker fees because they were working off stockpiles that were not affected with the higher rates. So as they start implementing those, they're obviously trying to pass those costs on. We expect the bunker to increase. That doesn't make up, a huge percentage of the overall freight cost, depending on exactly where that freight cost is, but everything adds up at the end of the day. So I I think that the tariffs, the situation in the Middle East, um, potentially some additional money hitting the market. It's going to be an interesting summer. I think there's a lot to keep an eye on, and it be best practice. We're working with our clients to make sure we're out in front of bookings and keeping things moving. The other aspect from the freight world is obviously there's longer transit times coming from places like India, Pakistan, those that are most directly affected by the conflicts in the Middle East that have high volumes of shipping into North America. You're talking longer transits. That's actually taking some of the space out of the market because these vessels are on 10 to 14-day longer transits than they were before. So it's not like you can just add vessels in, no problem, and you're back on the same schedule. A number of vessels are also heading the other direction and going through the Panama Canal that don't usually do so. There's no real issues in the Panama Canal. They're just seeing a much higher volume. The container ships have prearranged appointments. There's no slowing down there right now. There's no delays to speak of, but just noting there is disruption. And it's, as long as this war continues in the Middle East, there's going to continue to be disruption. And with disruption, I think people like the ocean carriers tend to have an advantage over the importers and exporters of the world.
Definitely. Thank you, Gabe, for joining us today. I think we got some good points across.
Thanks, Berkeley.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Between the Freight Lines, a podcast produced here at Rogers & Brown. If you have any feedback or recommendations for future episodes, please feel free to reach out. Thank you. We'll talk to you all next time.
This podcast is for general information only and is not legal advice.